I want to welcome everybody and say good evening. I'm Mary Ann Lax. I'm the Senior Manager of Education and Outreach at the Maltz Museum. And I want to thank you for joining us this evening for this virtual program at the Maltz Museum called Israel, the Holocaust, and October 7th with Dr. Avinoam Patt. Before we get to that, I just want to encourage people to come see our new exhibit, The Girl in the Diary, Searching for Rivka from the Łódź Ghetto and that's helping us to look to history to understand our present and consider our role in creating a better future. The story of the girl in the diary has never felt more urgent, and the exhibit will be at the museum through April. And we hope you'll consider a trip if you haven't seen it. It really is a very powerful and moving exhibit, and it originated at the Galicia Museum in Poland. I also want to encourage people to visit our website, maltzmuseum.org, for a complete listing of our upcoming winter programs. I also want to let people know that we have our next in-person program here at the Maltz Museum, which is an author talk for the book The American Way, A True Story of Nazi Escape, Superman, and Marilyn Monroe. And both of the authors will be here to talk about their book and share stories. I also want to let people know that we also have a movie series that's going to be coming up, and we just have a lot of new and exciting things. So please make sure you check our website. So getting back to tonight, our presenter, Dr. Avinoam Patt, is the Maurice Greenberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University. He holds a BA in religion from Emory University and a joint PhD in Hebrew and Judaic Studies and Modern European History from New York University. He's the author of multiple books on Jewish responses to the Holocaust and is a contributor to several projects at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He recently completed a new book on the early post-war memory of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which actually he'll be joining us again in April to talk about that book. But today he's here to talk about his newest book, Israel and the Holocaust. I also want to mention that he created and facilitated a new pop-up course at the University of Connecticut, Why the Jews Confronting Anti-Semitism, which reached over 1,600 students in the first semester it was offered. So with that, Dr. Patt.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Marianne, and thank you to all of you for being here for the program this evening. It's a pleasure to be here with you virtually, and hopefully I'll have a chance to see many of you before too long at some point in Cleveland. As you've just heard, I'm newly starting in a position as Professor of Holocaust Studies at New York University, and just wrapping up my current position, which is at the University of Connecticut, and just officially made that switch this month. So it's a pleasure for me to be here with you this evening. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see my PowerPoint presentation on the subject of our lecture this evening, Israel, the Holocaust, and October 7th. And as Marianne suggested in her introduction, this lecture that I'm going to be giving to you this evening is very much based on the topic of my newest book project, which is on Israel and the Holocaust. But I know that there are going to be many questions that relate specifically to current events and specifically October 7th. So my plan is to provide a great deal of context on the history of Israel's relationship to the Holocaust. We'll end with the most recent horrific events of October 7th and its aftermath. And I'm sure we'll have plenty of time in the Q&A and the discussion to look at the relationship between what I'm going to talk about this evening in terms of the history of Israel's relationship to the Holocaust and how it has already affected the way in which we have responded to October 7th and the way in which it might continue to affect those responses. So in this book project, I was fascinated by this question of why does the Holocaust, or Shoah, Hebrew for destruction, occupy an increasingly central role in the collective memory of Israel, even as distance from the historical event grows? Beyond frequent political invocations of the Shoah, mandatory educational trips to Poland, and the prominent place accorded to Israel's Holocaust Memorial Museum Yad Vashem as a destination for all political dignitaries, including visiting presidents, and you can think about all the examples that we have, and including Israel's former Prime Minister Yair Lapid, who was the son of a Holocaust survivor, who chose very symbolically a visit to Yad Vashem over the Western Wall when taking up office in June of 2022. In addition to all those factors, survey data also supports the conclusion that more Israeli Jews identify, quote, remembering the Holocaust as an essential part of their Jewish identity than any other category. Survey data that parallels the same Pew survey for Jewish Americans in the same way that remembering the Holocaust is identified as the most essential component of their Jewish identity. The proximity between the end of the Holocaust in 1945 and the founding of the State of Israel in 1948 seems to suggest a causal relationship between the two events. Some contemporary observers saw theological and historical links as well. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in the liturgy, this connection that's made between Israel being the flowering of the redemption and this idea that perhaps there's a relationship historically and theologically between the end of the war and the creation of the state. According to the historian Zev Mankiewicz, for Holocaust survivors after their liberation from Nazi rule, creating a Jewish state in the land of Israel was, quote, taken to be the last will and testament bequeathed by the dead to the living, while the Zionist project also signified, quote, warmth, unquestioning acceptance, and the security of home, and the only real hope for the rescue and rehabilitation of the little that remained of European Jewry, and in the longer term, the promise of the Jewish future. Here you can see an image that I'll return to, created by survivors in the immediate aftermath of the war, that shows this linkage between, at this time, the map of partitioned Palestine emerging from the broken tree that symbolized European Jewry. Accordingly, from its inception, the State of Israel presented itself as a place of refuge for survivors. Israel's Declaration of Independence, read by David Ben-Gurion on May 14, 1948, asserted, quote, the Nazi Holocaust, which engulfed millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of the reestablishment of Eretz Yisrael, of the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the community of nations. The survivors of the European catastrophe, the proclamation went on to state, as well as Jews, continued to migrate to Eretz Yisrael, undaunted by difficulties, restrictions, and dangers, and never ceased to assert their right to a life of dignity, freedom, and honest toil in their national homeland. Thus, in the self-understanding of many survivors, as well as the founders of the state, sovereignty was the uplifting, quote, redemptive legacy of the Holocaust, engaging the Jewish people in a journey from catastrophe to rebirth, from crisis to redemption. But at the same time, Palestinians, for whom the Nakba, or Arabic for catastrophe, began with the founding of the state and the subsequent 1948 war, also link Israel to the Holocaust, claiming that the international community gave the Jewish people Israel as compensation at the expense of Palestinians who paid the price for what Germany did to European Jews. This claim, popular throughout the Muslim world, is often linked to outright Holocaust denial and the negation of Israel's right to exist. And we can see this, for example, in Mahmoud Abbas, president of the Palestinian Authority's PhD dissertation, which examined what he alleged a form of Holocaust denial to be the inflation of numbers of Jews murdered during the Holocaust, or, of course, the former president of Iran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who was also very active in Holocaust denial and making this linkage. So it is striking then that both friends and foes of Israel alike argue that Israel was founded in some way because of the Holocaust. But the truth is, and I've spent a lot of my career studying this critical 3 years between 1945 and 1948, indicates that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the state of Israel was founded almost in spite of the Holocaust. The genocide had obliterated, in the words of Anita Shapira, the quote, central branch that had created multivalent Jewish cultures and was the Jewish people's main reservoir of human resources. Without then the single-minded dedication of the Yishuv to the creation of the state and the international community's continued failure to solve the Jewish refugee crisis in the aftermath of the war, the state of Israel may never have come into existence. The Zionist movement had pursued the goal of state sovereignty long before the Holocaust, but the European Jewish catastrophe enhanced the determination to seek sovereignty over a piece of land, no matter how small, because a Jewish state was now deemed an existential necessity. The Holocaust convinced Jews in the diaspora, especially in the United States, which now had the largest Jewish community in the world, of the need for a Jewish state. Ultimately, the founding of Israel resulted from realpolitik decisions of the international power players of the day. While the British wanted to leave Palestine as fast as possible since their empire was collapsing, the Americans sought to find a settlement for the 250,000 Jewish displaced persons in their zones of occupation in Germany and Austria. The Harrison Report, written by Earl Harrison, the special envoy for refugee affairs sent by FDR to tour the DP camps after the war, his report in 1945, and then the subsequent Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry linked the resolution of Jewish displacement in Europe with immigration to Palestine. And this was something that became clear to Zionist leaders of the Yishuv as well, as they saw that the Jewish crisis of Jewish statelessness in the aftermath of the war could be linked to the creation of a new Jewish state in Israel. As their stay dragged on in Europe, DPs, displaced persons, staged mass protests condemning the British blockade and participated in the migration movement or Hapalah to Palestine. In February of 1947, the British referred the problem of Palestine to the United Nations, and following the Exodus affair in the summer of that year and the report of the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP, the UN voted for the partition of Palestine on November 29, 1947, recommending that the resettlement of Jewish DPs be dealt with through the establishment of the Jewish state. And here again, you can see this. This is the Third Congress of the surviving remnant of Jews in post-war Germany, with that map of partitioned Palestine emerging from the broken tree as well. The Americans had some strategic interest in a Jewish state in the Middle East, thinking that it could be an ally in the Cold War. The Soviets also sought to consolidate their influence in the region, wanting the British out, thinking that a Jewish state could be socialist and on their side of Cold War decisions. Strategic political decisions at the beginning of the Cold War, not sympathy or guilt towards the Jews, led to United Nations approval of the partition plan, paving the way to the establishment of a Jewish state alongside a Palestinian state. At least that was the plan voted on by the United Nations. National sovereignty and partition of territories based on nationality, along with population transfers, were the dominant model of international politics after World War II. Even with an indirect causal connection between the Holocaust and Israel's founding at best, the Jewish state, nonetheless, exists in a conflicted relationship to the traumatic event. On the one hand, from a Zionist perspective, Jews are a nation deserving their own nation state just as every other nation. By that logic, Israel does not need the Holocaust to justify its existence. And I'm going to skip over a couple of slides here. You can see here most recently this proclamation by Naftali Bennett. Israel is ours because it's the Jewish homeland, not because of the Holocaust. On the other hand, Zionism is predicated on the notion that Jewish life in the diaspora was harmful to Jews and therefore needed to be negated, a form of shlilat hagolah, the negation of the diaspora, since all efforts to achieve full equality and acceptance by the nations of the world would fail. The Holocaust, then, was the ultimate manifestation of that failure. Therefore, the memory of the Holocaust has been a constant presence in Israeli life and is deeply enmeshed with Israeli self-understanding, Israel's relationship to the wider world, its neighbors, the Jewish diaspora, and the Jewish past. And indeed, in recent decades, there's been a new vein of post-Zionist historiography or writing of Israeli history, comfortable in critiquing the historical development of the Zionist movement and the Yishuv leadership, attempting to study this history from a, quote, objective, non-Zionist viewpoint, capable of incorporating the viewpoints of other groups, namely Holocaust survivors themselves. Tom Segev was a pathbreaker in the writing of this history of the relationship of Israel to the Holocaust, who they argued had largely been co-opted by the state in previous historical treatments. Scholars like Segev and many who have followed after him have investigated the Yishuv's response to the destruction of European Jewry and attitudes of Israeli society to Holocaust survivors in the first decades of the state. They've also explored the roles of survivors in building the state and how the trauma of the Holocaust shaped Israeli memory and identity. So what I'd like to do in the next few minutes of this talk is to examine the ways in which Israeli society engaged with Holocaust memory, not just in a way that was dominated by political elites, but also the ways in which a broader societal engagement, spearheaded by survivors and their families, very much shaped the way in which Holocaust memory functions in Israel today. While labor politicians like David Ben-Gurion and leaders of labor Zionism gave an ideological reading of the Holocaust toward a justification of how history could, quote, be overcome by national sovereignty and determined how the European Jewish catastrophe should be remembered, the political right since Menachem Begin has further politicized Holocaust memory by invoking the traumatic event as justification for all of its political decisions. Foreign policy, military strength, diaspora relations, relations to the Palestinians, and the broader Arab world. Yet, I would argue it's important to realize that politicians are only one of several agents in Israeli historic Holocaust memory, and they operate in a dynamic interaction with other agents like the courts, media, literature, culture, education, and elsewhere. And what we can see throughout Israel's history in the nature of its relationship to the memory of the Holocaust is there's an interplay between, let's say, the top-down political elements that want to control Holocaust memory and bottom-up broader societal engagement with it, spearheaded initially by survivors and their families, but now reflecting a much broader spectrum of Israeli society. And indeed, Holocaust survivors and their families have been part and parcel of global trends in memorial culture, elevating the role of survivors in Holocaust memory since the 1990s, to expand beyond the political sphere. So let's take some time to look at the broader history of Israel's engagement with the Holocaust. The Holocaust took a prominent place in Israeli political life and public life early on, although there was this constant tension between the crafting by political elites and grassroots level activities of survivors who sought to establish themselves there. Here you can see Tzivia Lebetkin, one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and together with her husband, Yitzhak Antek Zuckerman, creator of actually what was Israel's first Holocaust museum, the Ghetto Fighters House, opened in Akko on Kibbutz Lochamei Ghettot, the Ghetto Fighters Kibbutz, in 1949. Those who had spent the war in mandatory Palestine only had a limited understanding of the destruction of European Jews and tended to interpret it through the lens of Zionist ideology. Both political leaders, as well as the wider public, engaged in what we can call a polarized discourse, pitting heroes and victims against one another. So on the one hand, the few surviving partisans and ghetto fighters, among them Chaika Klinger, Rushka Korchak, Abba Kovner, who I showed you before from Vilna, as well as Tzivia Lebetkin and Yitzhak Zuckerman from Warsaw, were welcomed in Israel with great excitement and respect. And here you can see this is an image from June of 1946, when Tzivia Lebetkin first arrived in Palestine, what was pre-state Palestine in the Yishuv, to offer her first-hand account to the political leadership and the broader Israeli public of what had happened in the Warsaw Ghetto. The resistors, or mordim, like Lebetkin, were referred to as giborim, or heroes, and valorized for having saved the honor of the Jewish people. On the other hand, survivors, and here's a picture from the Warsaw Ghetto Monument in Warsaw in 1948. On the other hand, survivors who could not pride themselves in armed resistance met a wall of silence, disinterest, even impatience from veteran Israelis who believed that the majority of European Jews had either collaborated with the Nazis as members of the Jewish Council, ghetto police, and as capos, or gone passively to their deaths like, quote, sheep to the slaughter. And Marianne referenced my book on the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. I spent a lot of time unpacking that very problematic formulation. This polarized view of survivors also found expression in the terms that were used to describe them, including not only the Hebrew term nitzolei Shoah, which refers to those rescued from destruction, but also derogatory terms which were employed, such as avak adam, human dust, and sabon, or soap, signifying the supposed passivity of European Jews who, quote, allowed themselves to be murdered and turned into bars of soap, which was a myth that was debunked many times over. This view resulted from a number of factors, including lack of knowledge of what had happened and an ideological view that saw diaspora Jews as passive. Lastly, the lack of nuance in the perception of the European Jewish catastrophe also resulted from psychological inhibitions. The focus on heroic resistance was a defense mechanism when many who lost relatives in the catastrophe struggled with the shock of an event too difficult to confront, along with feelings of guilt and a sense of shame that the issue had not done enough to rescue European Jews. Just at the same time that the state in the making, however, absorbed large numbers of survivors and was assimilating information about their devastating wartime experiences, the country became entangled in an existential military conflict. Chana Yablonka, a historian, estimates that out of 82,000 Jewish soldiers who enlisted in the Israel Defense Forces, the IDF, between March of 1948, first the Haganah and then the IDF, and May of 1949, she counts 22,330 were Holocaust survivors. That means over 1/4 of the fighters at the time were survivors of the Holocaust. They had been recruited in the DP camps in Germany, Austria, and Italy, making the journey from liberation and survival in Europe into the War of Independence. Yet the contributions that survivors made to the 1948 war did not dispel disparaging opinions about new arrivals from Europe as weak, passive, and confused. Perhaps no event reflected the encounter between the pragmatic approach to mastering the past and the emotional reaction to German crimes than the intense debate over reparations from Germany. Israeli negotiations with Germany also reflected an early example of the politicization of Holocaust memory. How would leaders wrestle with the meaning of the Holocaust in both political and economic terms? In the aftermath of the 1948 war and the absorption of hundreds of thousands of immigrants from Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, including nearly 500,000 Holocaust survivors in Israel by 1960, Israel was on its knees economically. In these circumstances, David Ben-Gurion turned to West Germany to secure money to help the absorption process. Critics of negotiations with Germany argued that any money received from the Germans was, quote, blood money, intended as an expiation for their crimes. Such was the accusation hurled at the government by the opposition parties led by Menachem Begin's right-wing Herut party when the proposed reparations agreement came to the Knesset in 1952. The January 7th issue of Herut called on Israelis to, quote, remember what Amalek has done unto you, unquote, and to take to the streets. Labeling negotiators as traitors included artwork and photographs of murdered Jews to remind readers that there could be no reparations for the dead. Here you can see this image of an anti-Israel reparations demonstration in February of 1942 led by Begin, who promises to erase the shame and says in the Hebrew that our honor will not be sold for money. Or here you can see an account of the riot in the Knesset in January of 1952 to protest the reparations agreement. Nevertheless, the government entered into the negotiations with West Germany, which in the context of the Cold War was eager to enter the Western Bloc of nations. And ultimately, on September 10th, 1952, the negotiating representatives, and here I'll just click ahead to this picture, signed ultimately in September 10th, 1952, the representatives signed the agreement in Luxembourg. Moshe Sharet as the Israeli foreign minister, Nachum Goldman representing the Jewish Agency in the World Jewish Congress, and Konrad Adenauer as foreign minister and chancellor of the Federal Republic. And there's a great new documentary film that just came out this past year on this history by Roberta Grossman. West Germany committed to supply the state of Israel with goods and services valuing 3.5 billion marks over a period of 12 years. Germany also assured personal reparations to victims and the return of stolen property. Against the fierce protest of large segments of the Israeli population, the Israeli government made the pragmatic decision that the Jewish people were better served by building the infrastructure of its state rather than letting the past stand in the way. And you can see a summary of some of the reasons for why Israel would sign the reparations agreement. And yet, in the first decade of statehood, Israeli lawmakers cemented and ritualized Holocaust discourse through several laws which were an expression of the polarized views on the Jewish catastrophe and its survivors, while demonstrating that the new Jew, in quotes, had mastered the diaspora past. In April of 1951, the Knesset passed a resolution to establish Yom HaZikaron LaShoah v'Mered HaGetaot, literally Holocaust and Ghetto Revolt Memorial Day, to be held on the 27th day of Nisan. Previous commemorative events had been on the 10th of Tevet, the 14th of Nisan, which coincided with the date of the outbreak of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but was also the first night of Passover. The 27th of Nisan had the advantage of ending 1 week after the end of Passover, but still corresponding to the timing of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which lasted 4 weeks. By placing Yom HaShoah 1 week before Israel's Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, commemorating fallen soldiers leading to Israel's Independence Day, Yom HaAtzmaut, the state established a commemorative calendar that enshrined a national narrative arc leading from destruction to war and finally to national rebirth. And here you can see the statue at Kibbutz Yad Mordechai, which is just on the border with Gaza, dedicated to Mordechai Nalevich on April 19th, 1951. It would take until April of 1953 for the Knesset, and this, by the way, is the new Yad Vashem, not the one that existed in the 50s, for the Knesset to pass the Martyrs and Fighters Remembrance Law, Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, and in April of 1959, the Knesset prescribed a specific ritual, a 2-minute silence with a siren at sundown and at 11 a.m., and suspending all work and traffic, commemorative programs at educational institutions and the radio, flags on government buildings flown at half-mast, and a central government-sponsored memorial service at Yad Vashem. In August of 1953, the Knesset decreed the building of the Central Holocaust Memorial Museum of Yad Vashem. And the idea of a centralized memorial, although it had already been conceived in 1942 by Mordechai Shenhavi, had not been a priority of the issue of leadership. Now, in 1953, it was taken on by state leaders and lawmakers in a struggle to control memory and research in the framework of a state-sponsored secular memorial and research institution in Jerusalem. Yad Vashem was not, as I noted before, the first Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel. Yitzhak Zuckerman and Tzivia Lebetkin and other members of the Ghetto Fighters House had established that museum in April of 1949 near Akko. But another site, which is really quite fascinating, is a place called the Holocaust Cellar, or you can see here in Hebrew, Martef HaShoah, the Chamber of the Holocaust, on Mount Zion, which was more of a sacred memorial site located in 1949 as close to the Western Wall as possible, the holiest site in Judaism. Remember, in 1949, the old city was still under Jordanian control. This site, the Chamber of the Holocaust, which you can still visit today, had the backing of the general director of the Religious Affairs Ministry, Shmuel Lanzvel Kahana, and was created by survivors, really, as a site, an alternative an alternative cemetery for victims of the Shoah who had not been buried, with tablets in memory of every city whose residents had been massacred. You can see here, this is contemporary pictures of the site, a coat of revenge made from a Torah scroll, and it really reflected grassroots commemorative practices. Survivors brought salvaged artifacts and objects, destroyed Torah scrolls covered in blood, jars of ashes from camps to be interred at the cellar. The site possessed a religious character focused on demonstrating that Jews continued religious observance even during the Shoah. According to the scholar Doron Bar, compared to the secular nationalistic mission of Yad Vashem, which drew its authority from the quote, sacred Zionist national space in Western Jerusalem and its proximity to Herzl's tomb and the military cemetery, the Holocaust cellar, Martef HaShoah, drew its claim to authenticity from the East, namely from the Temple Mount, the Old City of Jerusalem, and David's tomb, reflecting a conflict between secular and religious groups. And I'll come back to this discrepancy between Yad Vashem's approach, which was sort of run by the professional historians, and the survivor historians, which would come to the fore around the time of the Eichmann trial. There were survivor organizations and Landsmannschaft and hometown societies in Israel who organized alternative cemeteries to commemorate the destruction of their communities and engaged in the compilation of hundreds of memorial books or Yizkor books in Yiddish and Hebrew. According to the research of Rosemary Horowitz and Micheline Amir, 75% of all Yizkor books were published in Israel, and 62% of them were published in Hebrew. There's numerous examples. This is actually from a cemetery in Holon to the south of Tel Aviv, where you can just see these incredible examples of memorials that became sort of a site to commemorate communities that had been destroyed on a real grassroots level by survivors of that community. Of course, survivors also published in the Yiddish press. They published poetry, like the poetry of Avram Sutzkever, and also published fictional accounts of the Holocaust, most notably the novels and novellas written by Katzetnik, the nom de plume of Yechiel Dinur, and we'll come back to him in a little bit. Katzetnik, who had been a survivor of Auschwitz, born in Poland as Yechiel Feiner, later changing his name to Yechiel Dinur, remained anonymous until the Eichmann trial. It was in the legal realm, however, that we really see a public space develop in which state-sponsored official modes of addressing the Holocaust and its grassroots level counterparts converged. For those who are not familiar, the trial of Rudolf Kastner was a fascinating moment to see this unfold. But already before the trial of Kastner, in 1950, the Knesset had passed the Nazi and Nazi collaborators punishment law intended to prosecute Nazi war criminals, although in most cases, it was Jews who were tried under this for supposedly having served as collaborators in helping the Nazis as Jewish council members, police, and capos. On the basis of this law, Israeli courts tried 40 survivors for collaboration between 1950 and 1973. The Kastner affair, which took place in 1953-54, was also an expression of the deep controversy over collaboration. In a nutshell, Kastner had been charged by Makliel Grunwald, survivor who had lost most of his family in Hungary, as having collaborated with Adolf Eichmann and Kurt Becher of the SS as part of the Blood for Goods attempt to basically ransom and save Jewish lives in exchange for providing the SS towards the end of the war with military hardware. Grunwald alleged that Kastner had selected to save his own family and his own friends and relatives at the expense of hundreds of thousands of other Hungarian Jews who he could have saved by notifying them that the transports were leading them to Auschwitz and to death. And the ruling against Kastner in 1955, the ruling judge, Benjamin Halevi, accepted most of these accusations, finding that by saving 1,700 Jews on the Kastner train, while failing to warn others that resettlement was in fact deportation to the gas chambers, he had sacrificed the majority of Hungarian Jews in favor of those he had chosen to rescue. This judgment was overturned by Israel's Supreme Court in 1958, but not before Kastner had been assassinated by a young right-wing extremist in March of 1957. We can see in this case this deep rift between the Harut party of Menachem Begin and the socialist Zionist Mapai at the time. We can also see it as part of an encounter between the emotional anger of survivors and the powerless Jewish communal leaders, and the attempt, the mixed with a deep sense of guilt for having survived while loved ones had not. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961 changed perceptions of survivors in Israeli society and furthered a more nuanced historical understanding of the Holocaust itself. Eichmann, who had been kidnapped in May of 1960 in Argentina by Israeli agents and brought to Israel, was indicted in February of 1961 and tried between April and August under this Nazi collaborators punishment law. He was found guilty and sentenced to death in December of 1961, and then hanged on the night between May 31st and June 1st, 1962. Holding the trial in Jerusalem was an expression of Israel's sovereignty and self-understanding as a representative of the Jewish people and of the victims of the Holocaust. Beyond establishing Eichmann's guilt, the trial was to instruct Israelis about the horrors of the Holocaust and the harmfulness of diaspora life. Attorney General Gideon Hausner often clashed with the three judges who sought to uphold this cause of justice and keep the proceedings at a remove from the political sphere, even if this proved difficult. Hausner's carefully composed case against Eichmann encapsulated the history of the Nazi mass murder of European Jews in its entirety, and in that respect, we can really see it as the first, quote, Holocaust trial in the history of criminal justice. He worked closely with the help of survivors like Rachel Auerbach, a survivor from the Warsaw Ghetto, who was the director of testimony collection at Yad Vashem, and compiled 108 survivor witnesses who would represent different countries and diverse wartime experiences. And for the most part, most survivors who took the stand felt empowered by speaking in the name of their murdered loved ones and being listened to for the first time. Hausner, who wanted Israelis to be able to empathize and identify with the survivors, presented himself as an advocate for the victims. I am not standing alone. With me are 6 million accusers, but they cannot rise to their feet and point an accusing finger towards him who sits in the dock and cry, J'accuse, I accuse. For their ashes are piled up on the hills of Auschwitz and the fields of Treblinka and are strewn in the forests of Poland. Their graves are scattered throughout the length and breadth of Europe. Their blood cries out, but their voice is not heard. Therefore, I will be their spokesman, and in their name, I will unfold the terrible indictment. During the trial, Hausner turned the experiences of individual witnesses into a Jewish national narrative, making the Holocaust a foundational Israeli experience. For example, when questioning Rivka Yoselevska, who'd survived an Einsatzgruppen mass shooting near Pinsk after seeing her father, mother, sister, and young daughter, whom she was holding in her arms, murdered, Hausner concluded with a redemptive coda, asking if she now lived in Israel and had given birth to more children. And in his concluding argument, he turned Yoselevka into a symbol of Jewish survival and rebirth. He, in fact, said Rivka Yoselevska symbolizes the entire Jewish people, the fact that she had risen from the dead and come back to life. And in the coverage of the day, May 9th, 1961 in Davar, we can also see this echoed in the coverage. Here's Rivka Yoselevska as well. The trial received widespread public attention. Ordinary citizens of all walks of life lined up to watch at Beit Ha'am, a concert hall turned into a courtroom, which could house 750 spectators a day. Scores of people gathered in public to listen to the broadcast. Here is Yechiel Dinur, aka Katsetnik, who testified at the trial right before he fainted. after his dramatic testimony. And even if much of the testimony proved largely relevant, it had legally, I should say, relevant, and had tremendous historical significance. And I won't go into detail, but we could talk about this more. But there are numerous examples of the ways in which the survivors who testified them really educated the Israeli public on important components of resistance, different types of resistance, the complexities of armed resistance, and the courage of those who offered to give their testimonies really was an eye-opening experience for so many Israelis at the time. The survivor, as such, as Chania Blanca emphasized, in many ways, the trial established a connection between the Jews of Israel and those in Europe based on a realization that only an accident of chronology separated them and no issue of value or quality. You stop to see as much judgment of survivor behavior or behavior of the victims in the aftermath of the trial. Yet, understanding the scope, I'm going to skip this for now, the scope of death and destruction during the Holocaust also augmented the sense of Israel's vulnerability and fears that the catastrophe would repeat itself in Israel's ongoing wars. In the crisis that preceded the Six-Day War of June 1967, when Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser threatened Israel with annihilation, promising to, quote, wipe Israel off the map, eventually resulting in the preemptive strike against Egypt and its allies Syria and Jordan, the memory of the Holocaust formed a critical frame of reference that guided public and political rhetoric where comparisons of Nasser to Hitler were commonplace. And even after Israel's unexpected military victory, the lessons of the Holocaust continued to resonate as the aversion of Israel's near annihilation seemed to confirm the necessity of a powerful military. As one young soldier remembered, people believed we'd be exterminated if we lost the war. We got this idea or inherited it from the concentration camps. It's a concrete idea for anyone who's grown up in Israel, even if he personally didn't experience Hitler's persecution. Genocide, this one soldier recounted, it's a real possibility. There are means to do it. That's the lesson of the gas chambers. And in many respects, these lessons also seem to guide Israeli foreign policy after the war, as questions of what to do with the conquered land and the millions of Palestinians now living under military occupation began to dominate diplomatic discussions. Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, although a proponent of a peace agreement that would involve some exchange of territory, invoked the memory of the Holocaust in resisting return to the 1967 pre-Six-Day War borders for an Israel surrounded by Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. He said, and this becomes a famous quote, "For us, this is a matter of security and of principles. The June 1967 map is for us equivalent to insecurity and danger. I do not exaggerate when I say that it has for us something of a memory of Auschwitz." And indeed, beyond this segment of the Israeli political leadership, among religious Zionist adherents of the newly formed Gush Emunim, or Bloc of the Faithful settler movement, the conquest of the West Bank and the Old City of Jerusalem, the return of the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, and numerous biblical sites to the Jewish state seem to be playing out on a meta-historical theological level that had post-Holocaust implications. Some even interpreted these events in messianic terms. And you can see this in the ideology of Gush Emunim and the what would become the settlement movement to return to the Judea and Samaria, biblical land in the West Bank. But you can also see it symbolically. So this is the scroll of fire, Megillat HaEsh, which is a Natan Rappaport statue that is in the Jerusalem Hills outside of Jerusalem in the Martyrs Forest. And you can see this linkage in the statue of sort of the destruction on one side and the essentially resurrection and then the return to Jerusalem on the other side. And indeed, we can see in these events of 67 and in the period of time between 67 and 73, in particular when we had the PLO's terrorist campaign against Israeli and Jewish targets around the world, seemed to only reinforce that the Jewish people continue to, quote, dwell alone and must rely on a strong Israel to defend itself. the September 1972 Munich massacre at the Olympic Games, which resulted in the death of 11 Israeli athletes and one German police officer in a botched raid, only seemed to heighten such continued parallels. And indeed, and I won't go in detail into the Yom Kippur War, although Israel emerged victorious in the Yom Kippur War of October 73, the surprise nature of the attack, heavy Israeli losses at the start of the war, dependence on American military support reinforced a sense of Jewish victimhood that had come to occupy a central place in Israeli collective identity. According to Charles Liebman, the war had shown that Israel was not the ultimate, quote, secure haven for Jews because its security is precarious, its survival dependent upon the support of a great power. And indeed, this challenged a central message of Zionism, a message which Liebman argued was reinforced by the Holocaust myth that there is no secure place for Jews except in their own land, where, unlike everywhere else, they are an independent, self-sufficient people. And indeed, I think we'll talk about in the aftermath of October 7th, the degree to which this notion of only Israel is safe for the Jews after the Holocaust has been challenged. The Yom Kippur War forced Israelis to acknowledge they had not triumphed over history, piercing a very brief aura of invincibility after the Six-Day War, while also coinciding with a new interpretation of heroism. In many ways, in the aftermath of the Eichmann trial, in many ways, the losses suffered during the Yom Kippur War re-traumatized Israeli society. We can see a shift taking place, the empowerment of the Mizrahi electorate against the Ashkenazi labor Zionist elite, all of which would help lead to the political victory of Menachem Begin and the Likud. And when Begin comes to power in 77, we see that he makes ample use of the Holocaust as justification for Israel's need for sovereignty and deterrent military strength. And we can see this repeatedly in Begin's sort of expression of his ideology. I won't go into detail, but you can see him explaining the lessons of the Holocaust as he interpreted them. Begin, who had fled the German occupation of Poland to be imprisoned in Soviet forced labor camps in Siberia before coming to Palestine in 1942, had lost his parents and brother in the Holocaust. His entire political career, from the battle against reparations to the anxious period before the Six-Day War, was shaped by the Holocaust. And he did, in the words of Tom Segev, more than anyone else to politicize it. When Begin received the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to achieve peace with Egypt, together with Anwar Sadat, he even invoked the Holocaust at the White House peace treaty signing ceremony in March of 79, identifying himself as, quote, one of the generation of the Holocaust and redemption, as a child of parents who, quote, sanctify the Lord's name with sacred blood, which reddened the rivers of Europe from the Rhine to the Danube, from the Bug to the Volga. And we'll see him invoke this repeatedly in numerous examples. This, at the time, also paralleled a deepening identification with the memory of the Holocaust, not just among survivors and their descendants, but on the part of the broader Jewish Israeli public. Starting in 1980, Holocaust education became a required part of the national education system. The March of the Living and state-sponsored programs to bring thousands of Israeli teenagers to sites of concentration and death camps in Eastern Europe were established in 1988, becoming an initiation ritual for high school seniors before they would serve in the army and cementing a sense of an existential threat and a need for military strength as well as national pride. At the same time, the 1980s and 90s saw a plethora of literary, cinematic, artistic depictions of the Holocaust that became an integral part of high school curricula and Yom HaShoah commemoration, or otherwise held a prominent place in the cultural sphere and the media. Creators were survivors, and we even see prominent survivors rising to very prominent positions. For example, the chief rabbi of Israel, Yisrael Meir Lau, saved who was liberated from Buchenwald as a young boy, and we can see the cultural creations of the second generation, in particular, rising to prominence in the 90s, especially. Even among non-European Jews, Mizrahi, Yemenite, Iraqi Jews began to identify in deeper ways with the Holocaust, some claiming the Holocaust as part of their experience, even if they were removed from the places the Nazis had reached during the war. Collective memory of the Holocaust became a unifying principle for Jews from diverse backgrounds. As second generation Israeli born Mizrahi Jews claimed in different ways they could empathize with European Jews, mainly because they themselves understood what it meant to be victims of discrimination. Um, and I'm going to skip ahead a little bit, but we can see that with the move to the political right that began with Begin, and especially under Netanyahu, Israelis have internalized a much closer relationship to the Shoah, and references to the extermination of European Jews became increasingly commonplace in the political sphere, both in internal Israeli political debates, as well as Israel's foreign policy, and especially in its relationships with the Palestinians and its Arab neighbors. And we see this time and time again, from the destruction of the Iraqi nuclear reactor, the invasion of Lebanon, the Gulf War, the first Gulf War with the fear of Iraqi gas attacks, terrorist attacks of the First Intifada, the failure of the Oslo Accords, the terror of the Second Intifada, protests of the Gaza disengagement. I'll come back to this in a moment. Protests over the Gaza disengagement, where we see sort of the protesters putting on orange stars and reimagining or performing the boy from the Warsaw Ghetto, to the threat posed by a potentially nuclear Iran, with Iranian leaders repeatedly threatening to wipe Israel off the map. The Holocaust continues to serve as the ultimate reference point and is constantly invoked. And we can see it also used as a rhetorical tool. So, for example, the opponents of the Oslo peace process, like Moshe Feiglin, charged Rabin as the Judenrat, loading us onto the trains or leading us like sheep to the slaughter. Likewise, Ariel Sharon, former defense minister in the right-wing Likud government, later prime minister, asked in 1994, what is the difference between the Jewish Council in the ghetto and the Rabin government? There, the Jews were forced to collaborate. Here, the government is doing everything of its own free will. And such incitement, as we know, would inspire Yigal Amir to assassinate Yitzhak Rabin in November of 1995. Nonetheless, in the aftermath of the assassination almost 30 years ago, we do not see a lessening of such analogies, just a debate over when such analogies might be accurate or appropriate, as we saw in the debate over the donning of orange stars by opponents of the Gaza disengagement in 2006. And while this is evidence that the Shoah has become crucial to Israeli self-understanding and collective memory, it is the frame of reference and primary association for most segments of society and for a new generation of political leaders descended from Holocaust survivors, such as Meravi Michaeli, who's the granddaughter of Rudolf Kastner, Benny Gantz, child of a survivor, Yair Lapid, child of a survivor. It is central to their own identities. Yet at the same time, it also shows that Holocaust memory's use and abuse has become increasingly politicized. And I'll just note that since the late 1980s, and I'm going to skip ahead here, since the 1980s, there have been critical voices, and I'm happy to talk about all of this later, things that I'm skipping over. But there have been critical voices, mostly coming from the left, phrasing Israel's relationship with the Holocaust in terms of what they identify as an obsession, resulting in what critics have identified as a surplus of Holocaust memory. The self-perception of Israelis as victims entailed, they argue, an inability to acknowledge the pain and trauma of other groups who suffered from political violence, including also Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, and we'll discuss this, I'm sure. This critique of a cynical manipulation of the memory of the Holocaust for political purposes also finds expression in increasingly frequent references to the memory of the Holocaust in Israeli humor. And this is something that I've written about extensively in other places, the way in which we see a type of Holocaust humor or comedic references or satirical references to the politicization of the Holocaust in Israeli comedy that we would never ever see in the United States. And I'm happy to discuss that. Even so, as one scholar of humor in the Holocaust argues, satirical skits about the Holocaust in Israel do not minimize or trivialize the Shoah, but instead simultaneously reinforce the centrality of the Shoah in Israeli society, while also allowing for critiques of instrumentalization and politicization of the Shoah in Israel. And at the same time, we see efforts to push back against uses of the Holocaust in the political sphere, whether through more intimate, private, commemorative activities like Zikaron Basalon, memory in the living room, or historical writing, which challenges some of the foundational orthodoxies. Regardless of what the historical record suggests about the challenges of drawing a straight line from the liberation of the camps to the establishment of the state, in collective memory in Israel, the two events, Shoah, destruction, and Tkuma, resurrection, become inextricably linked in broad public understanding of that history. As time grows from the event and the last living eyewitnesses pass, memory of the Shoah holds a central place in Israeli collective national identity, and it increasingly becomes the prism through which Israelis understand both their past and the nature of their present relationships with their Arab neighbors and the wider world. And of course, as we know, on October 7th, 2023, Hamas terrorists launched a full-scale surprise attack and invasion of Israel, massacring civilians, raping women and girls, dismembering bodies, taking hostages, and indiscriminately firing thousands of rockets and missiles at population centers throughout the country. With 1,200 Israelis murdered, nearly 3,000 wounded, 240 people, including women, children, the elderly, abducted and taken as hostages into Gaza. This was the largest mass killing of Jews since the Holocaust. Many Israelis began to talk about their traumatic experiences of October 7th through Holocaust references. Some Israeli leaders referred to Hamas as, quote, the new Nazis to justify the military operation in Gaza. Hamas, for its part, having held a genocidal fantasy of wiping Israel off the map since its 1988 manifesto and vowing to repeat October 7th indefinitely, called the IDF Nazis and Israeli civilians Nazi settlers. And critics of Israel and its military response in Gaza worldwide have charged Israel with, quote, genocide, which is now being debated in a very important court case in The Hague. Of course, some of these charges were being levied even before the ground operation began. It's clear that in the aftermath of that catastrophic day and the war that has followed, Israel will never be the same. And here you can see some of these commemoration techniques. For example, the Shoah Foundation recording testimonies by survivors. The notion that Israel exists to protect the lives of Jews from murderous violence has been shaken as the state seems to have failed in its mission. And yet it seems clear that for Israelis and many Jews and non-Jews around the world, the memory of the Holocaust serves as the strongest reminder for Israel why Israel must exist and defend its citizens. For many Israelis, the atrocities of October 7th will likely cause a deeper identification with the history of Jewish suffering during the Holocaust. We do not know what the future will bring, but the relationship that I've charted over the course of this lecture between Israel and the Shoah, it's almost certain, will be bound ever closer in the collective memory of the nation. Thank you.
So we have a few questions. First of all, I want to say thank you. Thank you for a very in-depth discussion. And our first question is, as Jewish communities in the U.S. are now beginning to plan for meaningful commemorations of Yom HaShoah in the spring, please provide some initial insight as to how the events of October 7th and what's continues may be appropriately and meaningfully integrated into the content of these programs.
Okay, excellent question. And I want to go back to where I ended up because in the slideshow, because I think that this is a very interesting phenomenon that we're seeing unfold with, for example, the Shoah Foundation recording testimonies of survivors of October 7th, and or for example, these sort of impromptu memorializations that are taking place, the shoes, right? Think about the shoes as a prominent motif. So what I would say is, and I'm not exactly sure. Um, what I can tell you is that it seems very, very clear that we are employing strategies that have been developed through decades of Holocaust commemorative strategies for how to memorialize horrific and traumatic events. We are using those exact strategies now in the sort of grassroots, right? Think about this. This is grassroots commemorative practices that are developing. Those are the strategies that are being used to both shed an important spotlight on the plight of the hostages, to commemorate the victims of October 7th in different ways. Um, and I want to make an important distinction, right, between, I keep showing this. I think it's important for us to make a distinction between what are politicizations of the memory of the Holocaust, as in the case of the UN ambassador Gilad Erdan in the United Nations wearing this, and this was very much critiqued in Israeli society, like as a crossing the line into cheap politicization of the memory of the Holocaust, versus meaningful commemorative activities. And so I think, right, there are some ways to answer that question more specifically. We know of a number of cases of survivors who were victims of October 7th. We know of prominent figures in the field of Holocaust education, who some of whom live in the border communities around Gaza, who are victims of October 7th, or even in one case are um, hostages still in Gaza, right? So one way to do this would be to both highlight the stories of Holocaust survivors as impacted by October 7th. It leaves us in this very uncomfortable place to think about sort of what October 7th causes us to ask about the role of Israel, the way in which the IDF and the army and the police failed to defend and protect Israeli citizens, and the idea that the state should exist in that way. But also, I think it's an opportunity. We have dates on our calendar, commemorative dates on our calendar, to begin to think about how we integrate this most recent catastrophe in a broader spectrum of horrible dates on our calendar.
Thank you. Another question is Israel was viewed as a safe haven for the Jews in the aftermath of the Holocaust, which you talked extensively about. Now that the physical integrity of Israel has been breached and atrocities committed against its people, what does it do to the psyche of Israelis and Jews across the world?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think one thing that we've seen, and it's interesting, I included this, I didn't talk about it, but I'll just go back to this resource, um, which I included not just the Shoah Foundations, which you can go to, and there's the URL where you can see testimonies of October 7th survivors, um, but also, sorry, there we go, eyewitness stories from inside the massacre. You can see, and it's now searchable, people talking about the way in which their sense of security on October 7th shattered that sense of security that the Jewish state was supposed to provide. What we're seeing, I think, and what I would predict is, and what I ended with, is a much deeper identification than even exists before with Jewish vulnerability, with Jewish suffering during the Holocaust, a challenging of the idea that Israelis overcame in some way, the plight of diaspora Jewry. We don't know if it's going to lead to closer relations between diaspora Jews and Jews in Israel, mainly because of this has a lot to do with political divisions, which, during the war itself have sort of been kept under the surface between a large segment of the American Jewish public and the Israeli right in particular. But we'll see, in terms of how that plays out in terms of a deeper identification with diaspora communities. Yeah, I think these are a number of ways that we'll see this play out. But I think in general, sort of a challenging of the notion, and there's a deep sense on the part of the Israeli public of distrust in the political leadership. I think we're going to see huge political changes in the aftermath of this, and a big debate about who can keep Israelis safe and what's the best way to do that. And that's going to be a huge political debate going forward, whatever the day after, whenever that comes, which I think we don't have to talk about now, but I think, of course, Netanyahu is trying to prolong for as long as possible.
Okay, so I don't have any more questions. Does anybody else have any other questions?
There were two in the Q&A, which I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, I hit
Okay.
those.
Okay.
Yeah.
I will just say that I'm very happy to see that one of them came from Jeffrey Terrell, who I know from our shared childhood in Houston, Texas. So hi, Jeff. Thanks for coming. We grew up together and went to all the same schools together. So I'm really happy that you're here. I didn't know that was your question, but thanks for asking that question, Jeff.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a third one in there that was that referenced that you didn't speak much about 1948, and I asked if there was a specific question with regards to that.
Yeah,
Um,
so the ways in which I referenced it, and maybe the questioner wants to ask about sort of other ways. The ways in which I referenced it that I think are quite interesting is the role that survivors actually played in the 1948 war, which is really quite fascinating and sort of underappreciated. The fact that about 25% of the fighters in the Israel Defense Force were survivors. And so for many
mhm.
survivors, this was an important way of facilitating integration into Israeli society and also countering that notion of supposed diaspora passivity in some way, which was completely false, but was part of the stereotype of diaspora Jews. Um, and yeah, so that I don't know if the questioner wanted to ask about sort of the other side of the 1948 war that I referenced, which was the birth of the Palestinian refugee crisis. But if that's part of the question, we can talk about that too.
Okay, I can give one more minute to see if anybody's typing, but I'm not seeing any other questions in there. I just want to say, Dr. Pat, it's been a pleasure having you, and this is the culmination of many conversations you and I have had in trying to put something together. So I just want to say thank you very much and truly appreciate your insights and your expertise in this area. And I'm looking forward to our second conversation in April about the Warsaw Ghetto. And
I
I
will be. What I'll say, Marianne, is to the person who asked about how some of these how commemorations of October 7th might be incorporated into Shoah commemorations. It will be really, I think by then we're going to have more of a sense. I'm really intrigued to see. I mean, October 7th is going to be a date on the calendar. The talk that I'm doing in April is timed roughly to coincide with the anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. But one of the really interesting things is that I alluded to very briefly is that on the Jewish calendar, April 19th, 1943, which I write about a lot in the other book, was the date that was the obvious date for Jews to commemorate the Holocaust because it was a date of Jewish heroism, and I write about a lot about why Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was chosen. But April 19th, as I know, coincided with the first night of Passover. And so it was really problematic how to do that on the Jewish calendar. I'll be really interested to see, and I suspect that October 7th, which is a secular date on the secular calendar, is going to be the date of annual commemoration. Not the fact that in the date that it took place was Shmini Atzeret and Simchat Torah in Israel, right? So that problem, which was a problem after the Holocaust in the early days of the state of Israel, of what date do we commemorate on the secular calendar, on the Jewish calendar? I don't think that, obviously no one's going to say we should do it on Shmini Atzeret, we should do it on Simchat Torah. It will probably be that secular date of October 7th, which is very telling also in terms of shifts in the secularization of Israeli society as well.
Mhm. And the next question that came in is just to let everybody know that this talk will it has been recorded and it will be up on the website in about a week. And Jeffrey has asked again, just like a U.S. soldier who fights in the war and gets killed in a crime back home in the United States, what does it do to a Holocaust survivor who moved to Palestine, Israel, and then was re-traumatized by the events of October 7th, either killed, taken hostage, or attacked?
Yeah. Well, I think, that sort of re-traumatization, I just, it's so upsetting even to think about having to go
Hmm.
through that. But yeah, I think we know what that means. Yeah.
Yeah. There's also a request if you are willing to share your email address.
Sure. So I think they can probably easiest is just to write to you, or my email address is just my name, avinoam.pat. I'll give you my Yukon one, which is at yukon.edu. You can just write to that one, avinoam.pat@yukon.edu. Feel free to be in touch with follow-up questions.
It's been a pleasure, and I thank everybody for joining us tonight. And we will look forward to talking to you again in April. In the meantime, stay safe and dry, and take care.